All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Undergraduate Research Fellows Symposium hosted by your UCLA Alumni Association and the UCLA Department of Economics. My name is Gerald Corporal, and I have the honor of serving as director of the Alumni Career Engagement Team with the Alumni Association, as well as tonight's host of the symposium. To begin our program, we want to start off with the land acknowledgement. And so the UCLA Alumni Association and the Department of Economics acknowledges the Gabrielino Tongva people as the original caretakers of the Tovangar. As a land grant institution, we pay our respects to the Honukvitum, or ancestors, the Ahihiram, elders, and the Eohinkam, relatives, past, present, and emerging. And so now, to get our program started, I would like to invite Professor Kathleen Mcgarry to join us and provide a few remarks to kick us off. So Professor Mcgarry.
Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming to our Research Fellows Symposium and to Gerald for hosting tonight. As Gerald said, I'm Professor Kathleen Mcgarry, the Vice Chair in the Department of Economics. And we are very pleased that you can join us today to showcase and celebrate some of our very best and brightest students. Just a bit of a background, the Research Fellows program was started about 5 years ago as a way to provide research experience and training to those undergraduate students who intend to go on and pursue a PhD in economics or a related field. This is our 5th cohort of Research Fellows, and past fellows have gone on to study at such places like Stanford, MIT, and Princeton University. The fellows are selected by a committee of economics faculty through a rigorous and competitive process. It includes detailed applications that require CVs, transcripts, and responses to essay questions. Those selected as finalists by the committee are then given interviews, and only the top 4 or 5 each year are selected as a new cohort of fellows. These really are the best of the best, and I wish I could show you some of their applications. It's just incredibly impressive what these students have accomplished. 4.0s across the board, graduate work in mathematics and so forth. It's very, very impressive. After they're selected, the fellows are awarded a $5,000 stipend to work as a research assistant for a faculty member of their choosing. Often they work alongside our PhD students as research assistants in this. So they're really getting their baptism by fire in terms of how economic research is conducted. Because they are sort of prepaid, they get to find their own professor with whom they want to work. So it's sort of flipping the traditional model. Rather than a faculty member in interviewing and hiring the student gets to choose the faculty member. Some faculty members don't have a role for a research assistant at that time, but for the most part, faculty members very much hope to be picked. I'll tell you, one of the members of our selection committee this year was approached, or actually interviewed, by a student in last year's cohort, but was ultimately not selected. And I can tell you he was certainly disappointed he didn't make the cut. But this program has been extremely successful, and we are grateful to the members of our Board of Visitors for helping to launch the program and for generously providing the funding. And a big thank you to our faculty advisors this year, John Asker, Martha Bailey, Adriana Yenismuni, Lee Ohanian, and Bill Zame for working with our fellows. I know that they are proud of what the students have accomplished. I also encourage you to feel free to go to the faculty members' web pages and look more at the work that they are doing and see what the fellows are contributing to. Finally, I want to encourage the students out there who are considering graduate work in economics to consider applying for the program in the coming year. Please look for an announcement in early September. And if others of you in the audience are interested in funding a future fellow, or if you simply have questions about the program or the department, please feel free to reach out to me. My email address is on the department's webpage, so it ought to be easy to find. So I want to thank you again for coming this afternoon, and I'll turn it back to Gerald, who will introduce our fellows and get the show rolling. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you, Professor Mcgarry. As Professor Mcgarry mentioned, we have had the privilege of working with 5 outstanding research fellows throughout this year. supporting them with the work that they're doing and also supporting their professional development. And so tonight we have really an outstanding lineup of presentations and topics to listen in on. The way our format's going to work is each research fellow is going to present, and throughout their presentation, the audience is welcome to pose any questions or comments on the chat box as well as the Q&A, and we'll keep an eye out on them. And at the end of their presentation, each research fellows will open the floor for any questions. And you, again, you could post questions on the Q&A box and we'll make sure that they get them. And then after that research fellow is done, we'll transition to our next research fellow, and we'll repeat that throughout tonight's presentation. So with that, we're excited to get things started, and I would like to invite Abhi Vemulapati to join us and begin our presentation. So Abhi, welcome, and we're excited for your presentation.
Hi, everyone. I'm Abhi, and the presentation I'll be giving is on the topic Innovation Migration, Occupational Choice for Entrepreneurs. Before I start, I'd like to give a few acknowledgements. First to Professor Ohanian for providing me a lot of guidance throughout this process. I'd also like to thank my parents for supporting me throughout college. I'd also like to thank Gerald for organizing the event and helping all the research fellows. And then, of course, the Economics Board of Visitors for sponsoring the fellowship. So just a little bit about me. I'm a junior studying math econ, and I'm also a departmental scholar in economics. And I hope to use the experience that I've gotten as a fellow to go on to do a PhD and explore my interests in research. So just to give a short overview of my presentation, I'll first go over a problem statement. I'll then go over some of the background literature associated with this problem. I'll go into the model that I created, and then I'll look at some related papers and the empirical results that they came up with. So first, to define the problem, we suppose a worker is working at a firm that produces an innovation, or the worker produces an innovation that benefits both the worker and the firm. So now, knowing that the worker can profit off of this innovation, the worker has several choices. She can license out this innovation to the employer. She can also move to another firm, do the same thing, or she can create a firm to market her innovation. And we want to think about the different factors that could affect this choice. And if you want to know why this is important, we can look at some real life examples, such as Steve Wozniak, who first created the prototype for the Mac computer while working at HP. And we want to think about the kind of thought process that led him to leaving HP to start Apple with Steve Jobs. So first, to go briefly into the background literature, the approach I took was using a problem with two components. First, occupational choice, and second, Nash bargaining in terms of intellectual property licensing. So the first component was investigated by Roy in his 1951 paper that looked at how workers would choose between hunting and fishing. And he wanted to see when it would be true that the best fishermen would fish and best hunters would hunt. And based on the right conditions, workers will choose the occupation that gives higher returns to skill. And while Roy didn't exactly formulate this model very rigorously, the same idea was used by Borjas in 1987, where he studied self-selection in immigrant workers. And he found similar results in that he found that workers will migrate to a destination country to achieve higher returns to skill. And as I mentioned before, the second component of the problem is looking at how the worker will profit off of licensing the innovation to the firm, given that the worker stays at the firm. And this can be thought of as a Nash bargaining problem. So to go into the basics of the model, we assume the worker is risk neutral and chooses between two occupations, a job or a startup, to maximize earnings, which are log normally distributed. And earnings are given by either job, which is some mean wage plus some randomness, which indicates how wages are distributed across the population, plus some licensing revenue, which is given by T. And for the startup, we have a similar setup, except now we have a cost of migrating jobs, which can be thought of as opportunity cost or cost of raising financial capital and such. And just to look at some basic analysis first, if we take any random worker, we want to find the probability that this worker who has innovated chooses to leave the firm that they work at to create a startup. And as we see, based on the assumptions we made about the distribution of the wage, which is normal of the wages for startup workers and for workers across the population, we use a normal distribution so we can model the rate of immigration between jobs using a standard normal distribution, which is dependent on the variables that we defined before. So before we go further into the analysis of the overall model, we'll first look at the Nash bargaining model. So the Nash bargaining model is a pretty important aspect of game theory in that it looks at how agents can cooperate in a bargaining problem. So the basic model of Nash bargaining is given by a maximization problem, which is the product of differences before an agreement is reached and after an agreement is reached. And the utility before the disagreement is reached is given by the disagreement outcomes, which is what the agents get if they decide to opt out of the bargain. And we can apply this to our current problem in the following way. We suppose that our worker works for a monopoly that has a linear demand curve and some constant marginal cost, big C. And so before the innovation is made, the profit for the worker should be 0, as they're not getting anything extra that they were getting before. And for the firm, the disagreement utility will simply be optimal monopoly profit, given the constraints such as linear demand curve and such. And now we suppose that the worker's innovation is a cost-cutting innovation in that it reduces the marginal cost of production to some little c. And now after the innovation has occurred, the firm pays the worker a constant per unit royalty rate. So now the firm is optimizing its monopoly profits given a new marginal cost C plus R, which should be less than the cost of production before the innovation was created. So if we use what was covered in the previous 2 slides, then we can come up with the following Nash bargaining problem, which is where we choose the royalty rate such that we maximize the product of differences after and before the innovation. And these are also weighted by some bargaining constant, which is given by beta, which tells us how much bargaining power the firm has in choosing the royalty rate. And then given the royalty rate and the optimal production quantity for a monopoly, the worker's licensing revenue is given by T, which is based on the monopoly's parameters. Now we can do some comparative statics on this function and to look at how the maximum, the optimal licensing revenue changes. So if we take cross-partial derivatives of the Nash bargaining function that we formulated, we can see that it's supermodular in certain parameters such as A and big C, and submodular in beta, which is bargaining power, and little c, which is cost after innovation. And so based on this, we can use Topkis's theorem, which tells us that the licensing revenue is increasing in A. Intuitively, this means increasing in production capacity of the firm as long as other constants, as long as other parameters are held constant. It's also increasing in the difference between big C and little c, which tells us that as the effectiveness of the innovation increases, the worker gets a larger share of the new profits. It's the revenue is also decreasing in beta, which is bargaining power. So as the firm has more bargaining power, the firm can allocate more of the surplus from the innovation to itself. And just a little note on supermodularity. A function is supermodular in parameter y if f is increasing faster as y increases. So now that we've looked at the comparative statics of the Nash bargaining problem, we can use that to look at how the overall rate of of migration from a job to a startup is affected. So based on what we learned in the comparative statics in the previous slide, we see that the rate of immigration is decreasing in firm size, or A. It's decreasing in big C and in cost of startup migration, as well as mean wage for workers across the population. And then it's increasing in firms' bargaining power, increasing in little c, which is the marginal cost for the firm after the worker has innovated. And it's also increasing in mean startup wage. So we can also look at something similar to what Borjas did when he first wrote his paper. We can look at self-selection and think about the interpretations of self-selection in this type of problem. So the expected noise or expected position in the wage distribution of workers who have migrated jobs, if they had stayed at their old job, is given by D0, and then D1 is analogous. It gives us the expected position in the wage distribution of startup owners, given that the person that you're looking at has migrated to a startup. So now intuitively, this is telling us that there are a few different cases. So if a worker is starting at the upper tail of the distribution of wages as a worker at the firm, and they end up in the upper tail of the distribution of wages for startup owners, then the reason they had migrated jobs is because the return to skill is higher as a startup founder than as a high skilled employee, which kind of ties back into the kind of findings that Roy and Borjas found. And then when the worker starts at the lower tail of the wage distribution as a worker at a firm and ends up in the lower tail of the distribution as a startup founder, then we kind of have the opposite effect, where the cost, quote unquote, cost of skill is lower as a startup founder than as a low skilled employee. And then finally, when D0 is less than 0, or when the worker starts on the lower tail of the wage distribution among regular employees and ends up in the upper tail of the startup founder wage distribution, this means that upward mobility, in terms like upward wage mobility, was restricted by the original employer. And then finally, the last case where a worker moves from the upper tail of the wage distribution and goes to the lower tail of the startup founder wage distribution is not a case that we consider, because I think it violates some preference relations. And finally, to look at some of the empirical results that have been studied in other papers. So we can look at, for example, Lamoureux and Sokolov, who in 2005, while at UCLA, found that the presence of independent inventors over time has diminished due to the high cost of effective innovation. And this cost includes, for example, the difficulty in garnering financial capital and such. And then on top of this, the rise of internal R&D centers, such as in-house incubators at companies like Google and Facebook, has created less risky opportunities for workers to innovate. So now they can innovate without the risk associated with creating a startup. So this is somewhat consistent with what our model predicted, because it told us that the attractiveness of startup creation decreases as cost of migration increases. So the cost of migration also can include the cost of and the difficulty of finding financial capital and such. But one thing we also might want to consider in the future when I edit this model is how the effectiveness of the innovation can also affect potential earnings if the worker decides to start a startup. And the current model does not explicitly account for this. So that's my presentation. Thank you everyone for listening. And if anyone has any questions, please let me know. Thank you.
Abhi, thank you very much. That was fantastic. At this time, I do not see any questions in the Q&A feature or in the chat, but we'll give it just a moment in case anyone wants to pop in a few questions. But Great work again, Abhi. That was fantastic.
Thank you.
And just in case there are no questions at the moment, or you think of questions you want to ask Abhi, what's nice is with the Q&A feature, Abhi we'll transition to our next presentation, but Abhi can keep an eye out on the Q&A, and if there's any specific questions for Abhi's presentation, we're able to address it in the Q&A feature. So I think with that, I think it's okay to transition to our next presentation. Claire Nelson, I'm excited to invite you to begin your presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Claire Nelson. I'm a senior math econ major at UCLA. This year, I've been working with Professor Adriana Yaras-Mooney on her project about the Great Migration of Black Americans North and the economic, political, and social impact on the South. I'd like to acknowledge Professor Yaras-Mooney and Ryan Boone for helping me work on this project with them, and the Board of Visitors for making this program possible. The Great Migration was the movement of over 6 million Black Americans from the rural South into the urban areas of the northern United States. Before the Great Migration in 1900, 90% of Black people in America lived in the South. And by the end of the Great Migration in 1970, just over half still lived in the South. Toward the end of the 20th century, we start to see a reversal in these migration trends as Black people start moving back to the South. In the decades following the Civil War and leading up to the Great Migration, the South was mostly agricultural and its economy was reliant on cotton farming and tenant labor. So tenant farmers are farmers that don't own the land that they work on, they rent. And sharecropping is a form of tenant farming in which sharecroppers rent a small plot of land from a landowner in exchange for a share of their crop at the end of the year. After emancipation, many former enslaved people made a living as sharecroppers, working on former plantations. The South lagged behind the rest of the country in farm mechanization and modernization, largely due to the availability of cheap labor in the form of sharecroppers. Tenant farming was most prominent in the South, and especially in the Cotton Belt, the counties in the South highlighted in blue below. Our analysis today will focus on the Cotton Belt, where many cotton plantations were located. In 1900, 60% of Black people in the South worked in agriculture, 94% of whom were tenant farmers or farm laborers. So this means that 94% of Black farmers in the South weren't owning their farms. Exploitative farm tenancy contracts and political disenfranchisement left many Black tenant farmers in debt to their landowner and without economic mobility in the South. As a result, many Black people sought better treatment and economic opportunity in the North, and many Cotton Belt counties experienced significant Black outmigration during this time. Here we map the change in Black population from 1910 and through 1940. So the counties highlighted in red experienced a decline in the Black population during this time, and blue counties experienced an increase. So as we saw here, the Cotton Belt stretches from eastern Texas into the Mississippi River Valley and through Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. And this map shows us that many of these Cotton Belt counties experienced significant declines in the Black population. In addition, many Black Southerners moved also to urban areas within the South and states like Texas and Florida. So the Great Migration lasted from 1910 through 1970. And this map shows us what historians refer to as the first wave of the Great Migration that lasted until 1940. The second wave of the Great Migration lasted until 1970, when migration patterns started to reverse. This study will focus on the impact of this first wave of the Great Migration, which was influenced by the following push and pull factors. Push factors are factors that drive migrants to leave the South. These include widespread discrimination, a lack of social and economic opportunity in the South, largely due to the institution of sharecropping, and natural disasters impacting agriculture, where the majority of Black people in the South worked. Pull factors are factors that attract migrants to the North. So these include the jobs created by World War I and left vacant as a result of immigration quotas in the 1920s. Wartime production and increased exports during World War I created many factory jobs in the North, and these jobs had traditionally been filled by immigrants to the United States. And when these flows of immigration largely dried up during quotas, this left many Northern jobs available to Black Southerners. The existing literature on the Great Migration has focused mainly on the Black migrants themselves and the regions receiving migration, the North. Collins and Wanamaker find that Black migrants earned significantly higher wages in the North. This is because overall wages were much higher in the North than in the South, and upon arrival, migrants worked better, higher paying occupations. However, many of the Northern responses to Black in-migration were disadvantageous for Black migrants and their future generations. Buston finds that the arrival of one Black person to a city in the North is associated with 2.7 white departures from that city. This white flight was due to a distaste for racial diversity and declining home prices. And Duranencourt finds that these Northern responses like white flight, increased crime, increased police spending, and increased incarceration eroded the gains of migrating for future generations of Black people in the North. Our study contributes to this existing literature by investigating the effect of the Great Migration on the people and institutions in the South, the sending region of migration. We hypothesize that this outmigration improved conditions for Black people that stayed in the South because migration provided a voice through exit. Amidst political disenfranchisement and economic exploitation, Black Southerners could vote with their feet and create change in the South by leaving. And we hypothesize that these improvements contributed to the eventual reversal of migration trends that we see in the late 20th century. Today, our preliminary results will explore the effect of Black outmigration on the Southern economy. We'll look at wages, the importance of the agriculture industry within the Southern economy, rates of farm ownership and tenancy, and farm mechanization. Our data come from the 1900 through 1950 census and census of agriculture. The preliminary non-causal model we'll analyze today regresses a county-level outcome on the amount of Black outmigration during the first wave. So for example, we'll regress the average wage in a county on the amount of Black outmigration in order to investigate an association between the Great Migration and wages in the South. So here we regress the average wage for white workers, the average wage for Black workers, and the Black to white wage ratio. So the Black to white wage ratio captures how much Black workers are earning relative to white workers. So a value of 1/2 for this ratio would mean that Black workers are earning half of what white workers are. And we find that Black outmigration is associated with lower wages for both white and Black workers, as we can see by the negative coefficients in columns 1 and 2. And we also see an increase in the Black to white wage ratio. However, this result could be driven by the fact that low wages may be driving Black Southerners to leave the South, rather than outmigration causing a decline in wages. Next, we investigate the effects of the Great Migration on Southern agriculture. So in order to assess the importance of agriculture within the Southern economy, we'll look at the share of both Black and white workers that are working in agriculture. We'll also analyze rates of farm tenancy and ownership to capture the status of farmers within agriculture. We find that Black outmigration is associated with a smaller share of both white and Black workers working in agriculture. And this could indicate a potential decline in the importance of agriculture in the Cotton Belt by 1940. We also find a decline in the share of Black farmers that are tenants and an increase in the share of Black farmers that are owners. And this would constitute an improvement for Black farmers within agriculture, as fewer are working in exploitative farm tenancy contracts and more are owning their farms. We repeat this analysis of rates of tenancy and ownership for white farmers, and we find no effects there. Finally, we will explore the effect of Great Migration on farm mechanization in the Cotton Belt. In theory, Black outmigration would be associated with increased farm mechanization. This is because Black tenant farmers and laborers provided a cheap source of labor to farm owners in the South, which discouraged these farm owners from investing in expensive farm technology. At the same time, this farm technology could be replacing the jobs formerly done by Black tenant farmers, and this job loss may be inducing Black people to migrate out of the South. So in order to assess the levels of farm mechanization, we'll look at the value of farm capital. This is the dollar value of farm technology and machinery, and the number of mules and horses. This measure captures the use of older farm technology. using livestock for farm operations instead of a tractor. Finally, we'll look at average farm size in acres. This is because more capital intensive and mechanized farms tend to be larger than less capital intensive farms. We find that blackout migration is associated with a smaller value of farm capital, which isn't consistent with our expectation. However, we do find decreased numbers of mules and horses and an increase in the average farm size. So this means at this stage of the analysis, we have mixed evidence on an association between farm mechanization and blackout migration. Overall, these regressions show us that blackout migration is associated with lower wages, a decline in the importance of agriculture, improvements for Black farmers within agriculture, and no changes for white farmers. And our future work will explore whether these associations are representing a causal impact of blackout migration on the Southern economy. To achieve this, we'll implement an instrumental variables approach. We'll compare otherwise similar counties in the South with differing levels of outmigration due to exogenous pull factors. Some of the potential instruments we're currently assembling are wartime exports and missing immigrants as a result of quotas. These measures capture the amount of Northern jobs available to Black Southerners in order to predict how many people will migrate from the South. We plan also to explore a variety of different outcomes in the South, and we're currently assembling data on lynchings, the existence of KKK chapters, arrests and incarcerations, votes for Democratic candidates, school quality, and religious memberships in order to better understand these social, political, and cultural conditions for the people that stayed in the South. Thank you very much. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Claire. Another fantastic presentation and topic. So great work there. Again, any questions or comments, please feel free to use the chat box or Q&A feature. At the moment, I don't see anything posted in, Claire, but similar to Abhi, if any follow-up questions happen later on the symposium, you're welcome to address them in the Q&A. But thank you again, Claire. That was fantastic. For our next presentation, or our next presenter, I'd like to invite Masha Malkonian to begin your presentation. Masha, it's all yours.
Thank you, Gerald. Hello, everyone. My name is Masha Malkonian. I'm a senior here at UCLA, majoring in math econ. As a research fellow, I've been working with Professor John Asker to investigate the connection between artificial intelligence and pricing. Specifically, we're trying to understand how the design of AI algorithms can influence market performance. There is a notion of antitrust laws and regulation, the purpose of which is to protect consumers and ensure there is fair competition in the market. In the US, these regulating agencies are the Federal Trade Commission and the Department of Justice. And now, as many firms start to use AI price setting software, it gives rise to a lot of discussion around how AIAs, artificial intelligence algorithms, can lead to collusion. And we want to see potentially what guidance can be given to these regulators to identify whether a certain algorithm is problematic or not. And to do this, I will first introduce the setup, the environment that we're considering. Then I'll talk about the main takeaways. I'll explain what AIAs are, and then we'll talk about our results. So we start by looking at two firms that are selling identical goods and don't care about what happened in the past or what's going to happen in the future. So we have a constant marginal cost of 2, and these two firms are playing a game with one another where they're taking actions, that is, choosing prices from our set of 100 prices equally spaced between 0.01 and 10. And our price set is discrete rather than continuous. And because of this setup, instead of having Nash equilibrium be equal to marginal cost, we're going to have two Nash equilibria at points 2.03 and 2.13, just above marginal cost. The market demand is going to be 0 for prices above 10, and it is going to be 1 for prices between 0.01 and 10. So when we have two firms, the firm with the lower price is going to get the whole market. The other one is going to get zero demand. And if their prices happen to be equal, then they're going to split the market. In this figure, we see what's going to happen when we have the firms choose prices for 5,000 periods. And they do this according to two algorithms, synchronous and asynchronous. And these two are different in the way they learn about their environment. So asynchronous, this one is going to occur when the AI only learns from the action that it actually takes. And then synchronous is going to do just like asynchronous, it's going to learn from the action it takes. But in addition to this, it is also going to conduct counterfactuals to learn from the returns that it would get if it were to choose a different action. And I'll talk more about the differences between the two algorithms. But for now, the main takeaway is that when we look at the synchronous, it only takes about 100 periods for the prices to converge to competitive prices. But as we look at the asynchronous, it is much more variable in the beginning and it takes much longer time, but eventually it converges to something closer to the monopoly price of 10. And now, how did we get this and how do the firms actually decide what price to choose? This is done with artificial intelligence and reinforcement learning. So we have our price set of 100 prices. And each one of these 100 prices has a value attached to it. And at first, this value is just a completely random number between 10 and 20. Now the AI is going to look at these values and it's going to pick the highest one. And then it's going to choose to play the action, the price, that is associated with this highest value. After that, some of these values are going to be updated depending on whether we're using the synchronous and the asynchronous. And now the AI is going to take a look at the values again and pick the highest one from our updated values. And then again, choose to play the price that is associated with the new highest value, update again. And this process repeats for just as many periods as we want. But the essential difference between our two algorithms, synchronous and asynchronous, is exactly in the updating rule. So synchronous is going to update all of the values. So each value that is associated with each one of the 100 prices. So besides computing its returns from the chosen price, synchronous is also able to observe the competing firm's price. And based on that, it can construct counterfactuals for the remaining 99 prices that it didn't choose. But it's going to use that to see what return it would get if it were to choose one of those 99 prices. But then if we look at the asynchronous, it works much simpler. It only has one update, and this update is just going to be the value that is associated with the price that it actually chose. So asynchronous is going to have one update per period, and synchronous is going to have a total of 100 updates every period. And we start to see why synchronous is learning and converging much faster. Here we ran both algorithms for 5,000 periods, and then we did 100 simulations of these 5,000 periods, meaning that we started the game all over again with 100 new initial values 100 times. And on both of these figures, there are 5 lines, but it is much easier to differentiate them on the asynchronous one on the right. So from bottom to top, they represent the minimum 25th percentile, median 75th, and the maximum across these 100 simulations. And what we see is that when we look at on the left for synchronous updating, it only takes about 100 periods for it to converge to Nash prices. But when we look at the asynchronous, it takes much longer time, and across simulations, they converge to different prices, but all are definitely closer to monopoly levels rather than competitive. So here we see that synchronous is great for competition because it is it converges to competitive prices. But it is problematic because it requires conducting counterfactuals and knowing the competitor's price, which may not always be realistic. So we're going to try to modify the asynchronous one to see if we can make it better for competition. But before we do that, let's understand how both of these work. So this is an animation for synchronous learning, and the black square is firm 1, the orange circle is firm 2. And the two firms keep interacting with each other over a course of several periods. And we see that it is just at about period 80 that it converges to our Nash equilibrium price. And it just keeps going like that till the end. And this one is a similar animation for asynchronous learning, but this time we're not tracing out the paths because the prices are very variable and it would just be too messy. But it works the same way, black square for firm 1, orange circle for firm 2. They keep choosing prices until we see that just at about period 2200, they converge to something close to 7. And so far, we've talked only about having 2 firms in the market, but we did similar analysis for 1 firm, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 10 firms in the market. And it is the same, it works the same way for synchronous when we have a different number of firms, but it becomes much more interesting when we look at the asynchronous. So let's take a look at that. On the left here, we have our old graph for 2 firms using asynchronous updating. But then we add 3 more firms to the market to have a total of 5, and we get the graph on the right. What we see here is that now there's a difference between the 2 figures, and when we have 5, the prices converge to something closer to Nash and sometimes even to exactly Nash, as opposed to what we had before when the prices would converge to closer to monopoly levels. So this price elevation effect that we used to have is mitigated when we add more firms to the market. And in fact, we were able to find that by the time we have 10 firms in the market, this price elevation effect is completely mitigated, meaning that across all of the simulations, the prices start to converge to just Nash equilibrium. And then we also found another way of mitigating this price elevation effect, even when we have only 2 firms in the market. To do that, we need to add 1 more assumption to our asynchronous updating. And this new assumption is going to be the knowledge that residual demand curves slope downward. Just adding this 1 bit of information drastically changes the figure that we have. So on the right, we see that now it only takes about 150 periods for the prices to converge to Nash or something very close to Nash, again, as opposed to needing several thousand periods and still converging to monopoly prices. And now going back to the question of what guidance can be given to regulators for knowing when an AI is problematic and can hinder fair competition, we can say that it largely depends on the design of an AI. So AI can be good or bad for competition depending on how the learning is implemented. We saw that the number of competitors and downward demand mitigate propensity of price elevation, meaning so if AI uses enough information about the environment, then it probably won't be a problem. And then when there's a lot of firms in the market, AI is probably going to be just fine too. And now I would like to thank my mentor, Professor Asker, for giving me the chance to work on this project. Thanks to my family for the support. I also want to thank the UCLA Economics Board of Visitors for sponsoring the Research Fellows program, to Gerald Corporal for supporting us, the Research Fellows, and of course, the people that created the program, Professors Mcgarry, Will, and Silvera. And this is going to be all for my presentation. Thank you very much, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you very, very much, Masha, and wonderful presentation. Again, for our audience, welcome to pop in any questions in the Q&A feature, as well as comments in the chat box. I don't see any at this time, Masha, but just keep an eye out in case any follow-up questions happen later on in the symposium. But great work and wonderful topic and presentation as well. For our next presenter, I'm excited to invite Minghao Pan to begin her presentation. Minghao, it's all yours.
Hi everyone, I'm Minghao Pan. I'm a junior math and econ major. My primary interest is macroeconomic theory, especially mechanism design and behavioral econ. As a research fellow, I'm working with Professor William Zane on optimal bankruptcy law. So here by bankruptcy, I'm referring to consumer bankruptcy rather than corporate bankruptcy. And the optimal laws depend on the context. It can be either utility maximization for the consumers or profit maximization for the lenders, like credit card companies. Or else, it can be socially optimal. And I'm very grateful to Professor Zane, who has guided me throughout the research. His passion has greatly inspired me. I would also like to thank my parents for their support, and thanks the Board of Visitors and Gerald for supporting the Research Fellows program. This is the outline of my presentation. I will begin with the background about bankruptcy laws. After that, I will discuss the questions we are studying. Then I will introduce our model and move on to our findings and the significance of our research. So the first natural question to ask is, why do we allow bankruptcy in a society? Broadly speaking, consumer bankruptcy provides debtors who are overburdened by debt a fresh start. So according to a recent research, most common factors for people to declare bankruptcy are income losses and medical expenses. So we want to give people who are in bad luck a fresh start. Economically, allowing bankruptcy is also socially optimal because bankruptcy can help people to smooth consumption across states. So there is uncertainty in people's future income. A person may be in good luck and earns lots of money, but meanwhile the same person may suffer from like illnesses or job losses. So we want to guarantee that people who are in a bad luck, or in other words, in a bad state, have some assets and have something to consume to meet their basic needs. So consumer bankruptcy is actually part of the social safety net. For the same reason, bankruptcy can encourage investments. Instead of putting all the money into saving accounts, by allowing bankruptcy, people are more willing to invest in risky projects, which is good for the economy as a whole. Bankruptcy laws vary across countries. In the United States, bad credit records, including bankruptcy records, are usually kept for 7 years. So after 7 years, financial institutions cannot have access to the bad records of the borrowers. When people declare bankruptcy, some of their assets will be seized by the creditors to pay off the debt. However, there is a certain fraction of their assets that cannot be seized. These assets are called bankruptcy exemptions. There are two main bankruptcy laws in the United States, Chapter 7 and Chapter 13. those who file Chapter 7 have a fresh start, namely, all their debt will be cleared. For those who file Chapter 13, a fraction of their debt will not be cleared, and the debtors need to use their future income to pay back the debt. The bankruptcy penalties are usually tougher in the continental Europe, while the forgetting policies and the bankruptcy exemptions are similar to those in the United States. Bankruptcy laws in both France and Germany oblige debtors to repay a certain fraction of their debt using their wealth and future income in the next few years. So, and another example is China. So in China, people cannot declare bankruptcy. So when people are in debt, their debt and the interest will keep accumulating until someday they pay back. We studied the following 3 questions. We think the current bankruptcy literature hasn't given satisfactory answers to these questions. The first one is, how much assets and what type of assets should be seized in a bankruptcy? This question is important because it greatly influences people's incentives to make loans and declare bankruptcy. So when modeling bankruptcy, people don't want to hold excess assets that will be seized in bankruptcy. The reason is that instead of having their assets to be seized by the creditors, those people who want to declare bankruptcy can always consume these excess assets before declaring bankruptcy. The second question is, how long the records of bankruptcy should be kept? In reality, it is very difficult for people with bankruptcy records to make loans, especially unsecured loans. In other words, they are excluded by the credit market. Restricting financial institutions' access to bankruptcy records is socially optimal for 2 reasons. Firstly, surely those people with bankruptcy records will benefit. Secondly, people are constantly changing. So those who once declare bankruptcy may now have a stable income and maybe safe borrowers. So it is not optimal for society to exclude all these people with bankruptcy records from the credit market. Meanwhile, we do want to punish those debtors who default on their debt. So there is a trade-off, and we want to find the optimal length of time for which bankruptcy records are kept. The last question we are studying is, what bankruptcy laws benefit the lenders? These questions hasn't been studied in the current literature to my knowledge. In the current literature, it is often assumed that the lender breaks even, but it is not the case. In reality, credit card companies make huge profits, and what's more, they are influencing the enactment of bankruptcy laws. For example, in the United States, there was a bankruptcy law issued in 2005, which makes it much harder for high-income people to declare bankruptcy with a fresh start. So in other words, these people still need to pay back some of their debt in the future when declaring bankruptcy. This act actually favors the lenders, and it is supported by credit card companies. There is an anecdote. By 2005, Elizabeth Warren was a law professor in Harvard, and her strong opposition to the Bankruptcy Act drove her to politics. And to this day, she is still fighting to repeal the 2005 Bankruptcy Act because she thinks this act harms the families too much. Here's a model we built. This model focuses on the length of bankruptcy period and the lender's profits. We assume that time is infinite and discrete, and there are entrepreneurs who are borrowers and one lender. Entrepreneurs can be thought as small business owners. And each period, every active entrepreneur draws a project independently, and projects differ in their success probability and returns. An entrepreneur can either take the risky project or work at a safe job. The safe job pays a fixed amount of money. If an entrepreneur carries out the risky project, she needs funding, and we assume that the entrepreneurs have no savings at all, so she has to borrow from the lender to fund her project. The lender does not know the success probability and the returns of the project the entrepreneurs want to take, so there is asymmetric information between the lender and the entrepreneurs. So after the lender funds a project and the project is carried out, if the project is successful, then the entrepreneur repays the loan with interest. If, on the other hand, the project fails, the entrepreneur has to declare bankruptcy, and the bankruptcy penalty is that the entrepreneur will be excluded from the credit market for some period. During this period, she can only take the safe job, but cannot take the risky projects. After this period passed, the entrepreneur will be readmitted to the credit market and take risky projects again. We consider two different scenarios. The first one is bankruptcy penalty is effective, meaning that bankruptcy entrepreneurs are indeed excluded from the credit market for some periods. The second is there is no bankruptcy penalty at all. And in other words, even though projects fail and entrepreneurs default on their debt, they can still borrow in the next period immediately. We found that, quite surprisingly, under some conditions of parameters, compared with no bankruptcy penalty, punishing bankruptcy entrepreneurs for some periods can benefit both the lender and the entrepreneurs themselves. So we assume that there are high-risk projects and low-risk projects. When there is no bankruptcy penalty, entrepreneurs are willing to take both projects, but the lender does not want to fund high-risk projects. The lender is only willing to fund the low-risk projects. Because once the projects fail, the lender loses the principal as well as the interest. By funding the high-risk projects, the lender has negative expected profits. So once there is bankruptcy penalty, the cost of high-risk projects will increase, so entrepreneurs may be discouraged from taking those high-risk projects. So this is good for the lender because, once again, the lender does not want to fund high-risk projects. And in order to give entrepreneurs incentives to only take low-risk projects, the lender should lower the interest rate so that low-risk projects are more appealing to entrepreneurs, and thus increase the opportunity cost of bankruptcy. The entrepreneurs can benefit from the lower interest rate. So this is why the entrepreneurs can also benefit from the bankruptcy penalty. So our idea is that a longer bankruptcy period serves as a harsh punishment that can exclude high-risk projects, or it can exclude high-risk entrepreneurs if we assume they are heterogeneous agents. Meanwhile, the fraction of active entrepreneurs will decline as the bankruptcy period extends. So there is a trade-off between punishing high-risk projects or entrepreneurs and admitting low-risk projects or entrepreneurs to the market. So the optimal length of time that a bankruptcy entrepreneur is excluded from the credit market should not be too long or too short. And in our future study, we want to find this optimal length of time for which bankruptcy entrepreneurs are excluded from the credit market and under different settings of the parameters. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you, Minghao. Great presentation. Just checking the Q&A box. No questions yet either for you or comments, but like everyone else, just keep an eye out in case there's any follow-up questions. Actually, looks like one just came in. Oh, someone said, good job, Minghao. So great work. Perfect. All right, so our final presentation of the symposium is going to be David Yu. So David, excited to invite you up to begin your presentation.
Awesome. Yeah. Hi, everyone. My name is David. I'm a third-year research fellow majoring in math and econ. And for the past 2 quarters, I've been working under Professor Martha Bailey on a project about legislation such as the Equal Pay Act, EPA, and its effect on the gender wage gap, GWG. So before I start, I just want to give a few acknowledgements to my family for supporting me while I've been living at home for over a year now, to Professor Bailey and my collaborator, Eric Wong, for providing tons of helpful mentorship and guidance through this whole process. And of course, to all the people at the Research Fellows program, the Board of Visitors for funding, Professor Mcgarry for founding and directing, and Gerald Corporal for making sure that everything always goes off without a hitch. Yeah, so I'm going to first talk a little bit about the historical background and the research design that we have adopted. And then I'll talk mainly about 2 different threads of research that I've been working on. One to do with some data that we've collected from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and one to do with some newspaper job ads. So the most important law that we're studying is the Equal Pay Act, which passed in 1963. And the slogan version that I like to remember is just equal pay for equal work. So the Equal Pay Act was a very, it had a lot of symbolic strength, but in terms of actual output, it was interpreted as being quite limited. For one, it only applied to occupations that were covered by the Fair Labor Standards Act. And for another, it didn't extend to other parts of the employment process. So this was kind of rectified by the Civil Rights Act, which obviously influenced a lot of different things, but with regards to sex-based discrimination, it guaranteed equality of rights under the law and extended the Equal Pay Act in both of the dimensions that I mentioned earlier in terms of broadening its reach to more occupations, and then also extending to all parts of the employment process, including hiring, firing, and promotions. So prior analysis of these laws have generally found that there wasn't a lot of effect in terms of closing the gender wage gap. So if one assumes that the goal of the Equal Pay Act was to, ensure equal pay, then most previous authors have concluded that it failed. What we are trying to do is re-examine this question by drilling down to the occupational level, which is a much finer analysis than what previous work has done. We are trying to follow David Card's strategy of measuring the bite of these laws. What this means is that we identify occupations and look at how big the gender wage gap was in each occupation, and then look how look at how it may have changed after these laws passed. And we would expect, if the Equal Pay Act and Civil Rights Act had any effect, we would expect that this occupations where the gap was bigger to start with would have closed by more. So a bigger bite in some sense. So the first set of data that we have collected is called the Occupational Wage Survey. And so the Bureau of Labor Statistics does this. They did this every year by going around to about 80 metropolitan areas, and they would survey all of the firms, a sample of the firms, and ask, what employees do you have, and what categories, what occupations do they work in, how many are there, and how much do they get paid, among other things. So you can see in the screenshot, in the left column, there are occupations, and then the next two columns on the right, there's the number of workers and their average pay. So this is an example of what the data booklets produced by the BLS might look like. So the fineness of the data that was collected by the BLS allows us to study industry occupation cities, which are, all the people working in a certain job in a certain industry in a particular city. And this is what we substitute for like a job level analysis. So by using the BLS data, we're allowed to then compare occupations across the country, because the BLS has already interviewed the firms and understood what the specific job descriptions are of these people, and then been able to categorize them into a sort of standard buckets so that you can make comparisons across cities. So we were unable, unfortunately, to collect this data in any sort of efficient, automated way. So we've actually been digitizing it at 3 different points in time. In the 1958 to 1959 survey, in 1963, when the Equal Pay Act passed, and then in 1966 to 67. So in this way, we can establish a baseline and then look at the effects of the Equal Pay Act as time progresses. So we're still in the process of collecting the 1966 to 67 data, but we have done the first 2 points in our 3-point analysis, and we've produced some cross-sectional results based on it. So first, I just want to highlight some of the most extreme occupations in terms of the gender wage gap. So on one end, we have elevator operators, in which women got paid on average 75% of what men did. And on the other end of the spectrum, we have office workers, where women made 98% of what men did. You can see in the graph on the right, kind of just a rough histogram of log wages separated by sex. And we've also been studying kind of the advantage of being a man in this time. And we estimate that, working in the same job will get you a 29% wage increase. Although we're still working on, making sure that we've controlled for things like geographical differences and other such things. So another important thing that we're studying is this gender wage gap decomposition. What I mean by this is that, if you look at a newspaper article where they cite what the gender wage gap is, and they say, women make, 65 cents for every dollar men make, the way we're trying to separate that out is into 2 categories. The first category being the gender wage gap that arises from working in different occupations. So if a man and women are just in different jobs and just do totally different things, they'll get paid differently for that. And the second type of our decomposition is the within occupation. So that's like, in the elevator operator's case, a man and a woman who are working in the same occupation, but are making a different amount of money for the same work. So in 1959, we find that the gender wage gap overall, so including both the occupational differences and the within occupation differences, is 77 cents. And then once you restrict to just jobs in which you have observations for both men and women, it goes up to 86 cents. So women making 86 cents for every dollar men make in occupations where they are both working. In 1963, you see we have pretty similar results, 78 cents as an overall gap, and then 87 cents within each occupation. So this is kind of how far we've gone so far. What we are currently working on and what we'd like to continue doing is a industry level analysis. So if you recall from my slide about the data a few slides ago, there are actually subsets in each occupation. There are subsets by industry, such as manufacturing and non-manufacturing. And so we'd like to look at how the gender wage gap evolved within these industries. In the graphic on the right, this shows wages separated in 2 dimensions by sex and then by industry. So the green and blue plots are for women, and then the red and yellow are for men. So you can also see that in both genders, the manufacturing distribution is higher than the non-manufacturing distribution. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the second data set that we have been working with. This is a collection of classified ads from newspapers such as the New York Times and the Boston Globe from the 60s and 70s, right around when the Equal Pay Act and the related legislation was being passed. We're trying to follow the work that was done by Adelaide in his paper, The Evolution of Work in the United States, which studies a data set that's very similar to this. It's also newspaper ads. And it looks at how job titles and job descriptions have changed over time. And one thing that they didn't study at all was differences by sex. And so obviously, given what we're trying to do, that's something that we are also interested in. On the right, I have a graphic showing a scan of what the data looks like, an example of it. And you can see there are ads for example, for typists, a bunch of different ads for typists. And at the top of each column, I've highlighted with a red circle, there's a help wanted female, and then there's also a help wanted male. So this is how classified ads were sorted at the time. There was, if you were a man, then you would look for a job in the men's section. If you're a woman, in the women's section. So this is something that the Adelaide data, they didn't have it. They didn't collect that little header at the very top, but that's something that we are going to hopefully get. And so then we're going to be able to make comparisons across gender and look at how things evolved over time. We're still in the process of trying to acquire the data. The raw data, as I've shown here, is freely accessible, but to get it digitized by the company that provides it is pretty costly, and it's a little tricky. So we're still working on that. But in the meantime, we have been qualitatively evaluating some ideas that we have for what we could do. One of them is job title proportions. And what I mean by that is that we're hoping to study, if you remember at the beginning of each ad, usually it shows the job title. So we would we're hoping to isolate that and then look at, how many ads for, say, secretaries there were in the men's section and the women's section, and how that could have changed over time. And our hypothesis is that, after the Equal Pay Act came out and it said that you had to give people equal pay for equal work, firms who had practiced discrimination before and wanted to continue doing so, one strategy they could employ is to basically just say that, men and women were actually working in different occupations and give them different job titles, and thus continue justifying the wage gap in that way. So that's one thing that we're interested in. Another thing is we want to look at how many ads actually contain a posted wage in the advertisement. Qualitatively, before 1963, before the Equal Pay Act, a lot of ads had this. About half of them would say, you're going to get paid $2 an hour or whatever it was. And then after the Equal Pay Act was passed, there's kind of a noticeable drop off. But again, that's just something that, I've just been looking at a bunch of different newspaper ads to find that. So it's certainly far from a conclusive finding. And that's another thing that we'd like to do if and when we can get our hands on the data. And finally, we want to also look at how wage discrimination might have evolved as you move between different levels of education. So this would be, looking at minimum wage workers, looking at college educated workers, and how their job titles might have changed and how big or small the wage gap might have been at these different levels. So I want to conclude just by talking a little bit about the main points of the research that we've done. Our main strategy is to look at the occupation level, which is much finer than the levels previously used. We want to look at how big of a bite the legislation such as the Equal Pay Act and the Civil Rights Act had by identifying occupations where the gender wage gap was big, and then seeing how it was affected. And we're going to do this using the 3-point analysis by gathering data before, during, and after the legislation and looking at how the gap evolves over time. And with that, I'd like to conclude. Thank you guys very much for listening to my presentation. And if there are any questions, I'd love to answer them.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, David. That was great and a great way to wrap up our presentations. Just giving a quick moment in case anyone has any questions in the Q&A feature of the chat box for you or for any of our research fellows. So just stick around for a second. Thank you, Professor McDevitt, who says great job to all of our wonderful research fellows. And yeah, with that, I'll close up our symposium by saying, just a big thank you to all of our attendees and guests that were able to join this evening. We really appreciate you having you with us and appreciate you observing our presentations. And, just want to reiterate our thanks to the UCLA Economics Board of Visitors, Professor Mcgarry, and then for our research fellows, like I said, it's been an absolute pleasure working with you all throughout this year. And it was really great to see your work throughout the past 2 quarters and see it sort of culminate today. And I know you've got a few weeks left to wrap things up, but it's really great to see your projects. So thank you again, everyone. And thank you so much, research fellows. Wish you all a good evening and go Bruins. Thank you, everyone.